The most dangerous place for 7-year-old Olivia Gant wasn't a dark alley or a stranger's car. It was a brightly lit hospital room surrounded by some of the best pediatric specialists in the country. For years, her mother, Kelly Turner, was hailed as a warrior, a tireless advocate fighting for a terminally ill child. But the metals of maternal devotion were forged in deception. The ultimate betrayal didn't happen in the shadows. It happened right in front of a cheering public, funded by their donations and facilitated by the very doctors sworn to do no harm. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Kelly Turner relocated her family from Texas to Colorado with a singular, publicly stated mission: saving her daughter. The Denver area offered premier pediatric facilities, the kind of high-level care that her middle child, Olivia, supposedly required just to survive. To the outside world, Kelly was the absolute embodiment of maternal sacrifice. She was the exhausted woman sleeping in uncomfortable vinyl hospital chairs, the fierce advocate demanding answers from specialists, the cornerstone of a family under siege by an invisible, relentless enemy. Her social media feeds were a meticulously curated gallery of medical trauma, images of tangled IV lines, oxygen masks, and sterile hospital rooms, always accompanied by lengthy, emotionally charged captions detailing the latest devastating crisis. The subject of these posts was a stark contrast to the grim narrative spun around her. Born in 2010, the young girl possessed an incandescent energy that completely defied the labyrinth of diagnoses attached to her medical chart. She loved princesses, bright colors, and singing. Even when tethered to heavy medical equipment, the child found ways to play, projecting a resilience that made her story all the more heartbreaking to those watching from the outside. People were naturally drawn to her bright smile, completely unaware that the cheerful girl dressed as a superhero was actually the central prop in an elaborate, deadly theater production. The medical history presented by the mother was overwhelming, a cascading avalanche of severe conditions that seemed to defy logic. What started as vague complaints of constipation and minor developmental delays in Texas rapidly escalated upon their arrival in Colorado. Kelly reported that her daughter was suffering from severe encephalopathy, a debilitating brain disease, along with total intestinal failure. She insisted that the child could not digest food, could not properly process nutrients, and was plagued by a chaotic seizure disorder that required constant, heavy medication. The sheer volume of these claims created a dense smokescreen. When a parent presents a child with such a catastrophic, complex web of symptoms, the initial instinct of any medical professional is not suspicion. It is an urgent, immediate desire to stabilize and heal. This was the psychological battleground where Kelly thrived. She was an expert at navigating the complex healthcare system, learning to speak the precise clinical language of doctors. Utilizing advanced medical terminology lent a false air of credibility to her desperate pleas. She knew exactly how to manipulate the inherent trust built into the pediatric medical model, a system that relies heavily on a parent's self-reporting of symptoms, especially for nonverbal or very young children. If a mother reports that a child suffered a massive seizure at home or violently vomited every ounce of formula overnight, the doctor must act on that information. Kelly weaponized the doctor's oath to do no harm, effectively turning their empathy into an instrument of abuse. If a specialist ever showed hesitation or suggested that the physical symptoms didn't align with the blood work and test results, the mother simply packed up and found a new physician. She left a trail of confused pediatricians in her wake, constantly resetting the narrative with a fresh, unsuspecting medical team. The sterile smell of hospital sanitizer and the rhythmic, synthetic hum of feeding pumps became the permanent backdrop of the child's existence. As the list of supposed ailments grew, so did the local response. The family became a prominent cause célèbre in the Denver suburbs. Neighbors, church groups, and eventually local news outlets rallied around the struggling household. Fundraisers were organized, thousands of dollars in cash donations poured in to cover mounting medical debts, and Kelly basked in the warm glow of collective sympathy. The atmosphere surrounding the family was one of constant, heavy mourning for a life that was supposedly slipping away. Yet, through it all, those who interacted directly with the little girl often noted how surprisingly vibrant she seemed during her good moments. These observations were quickly brushed aside, rationalized as the sheer willpower of a terminally ill child putting on a brave face for the world. No one dared to question the devastated mother weeping softly in the hospital corridor, because the alternative, that a parent was deliberately manufacturing her child's suffering, was simply too monstrous for the human mind to accept. The descent into the medical labyrinth began with vague, unverifiable complaints, but rapidly morphed into aggressive, irreversible surgical interventions. The mother claimed the child's intestines had completely ceased functioning, presenting a narrative of constant, agonizing pain and a violent rejection of all food. Doctors, acting on these alarming reports, ordered a surgically implanted G-tube directly into the stomach. When Kelly insisted that this too was failing, that the child was still violently ill, the medical team escalated the treatment to a terrifying new level. They bypassed the digestive tract entirely. A central venous catheter was surgically tunneled into the child's chest to deliver total parenteral nutrition. This thick, milky intravenous fluid provided raw, synthetic nutrients directly into the bloodstream. It was a catastrophic physiological turning point. The girl was now physically tethered to medical machinery, her natural bodily functions artificially overridden, based almost exclusively on a fabricated timeline of symptoms. The surgical interventions did not stop there. A colostomy procedure eventually routed her colon to an external opening on her abdomen. Her small, fragile body was systematically dismantled, mapped with deep scars from procedures she never actually needed. The hospital room evolved into a permanent residence, defined by the sterile scent of iodine and the relentless, synthetic beeping of infusion pumps. This physical trauma was heavily compounded by a suffocating chemical fog. Kelly insisted her daughter was suffering from excruciating bone pain and chaotic, untraceable seizure clusters. To manage these invisible ailments, specialists prescribed a potent, highly dangerous cocktail of heavy narcotics and powerful anti-seizure medications. The dosage was staggering for a child weighing barely 40 pounds. The drugs induced genuine, severe side effects: chronic lethargy, intense nausea, cognitive blunting, and severe disorientation. The mother then triumphantly pointed to these very side effects as concrete proof of the underlying, mysterious disease. It was a perfectly executed, impenetrable feedback loop of abuse. The very treatments designed to save the girl were actively poisoning her, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of physical decline. The child would lie in her hospital bed for days, eyes glazed over from heavy sedatives, while her mother sat beside her, meticulously updating online blogs about the heartbreaking deterioration. While the child languished in a medically induced haze, the mother cultivated a massive, intensely loyal public following. She launched multiple crowdfunding campaigns, raising over $22,000 in cash to ostensibly cover specialized care and mounting travel debts. Local news crews were frequently invited into the home and the pediatric ward. During these broadcasts, Kelly flawlessly executed the role of the tragic, exhausted heroine. She spoke softly, wiping away tears, recounting her daughter's brave battle against an unnamed terminal enemy. The community responded with an overwhelming outpouring of unconditional support, organizing benefit dinners and prayer vigils. This wave of public sympathy culminated in a massive, citywide Make-A-Wish event that bordered on the surreal. The foundation, operating under the absolute belief that the child had only months to live, went to extraordinary logistical lengths to fulfill a bizarre bucket list entirely curated by the mother. The little girl, dressed in a custom superhero costume as the Bat Princess, was celebrated by hundreds of volunteers in the bright Colorado sunshine. She rode in the passenger seat of a Denver police cruiser with lights flashing and sirens blaring. She sprayed a heavy water hose from a towering fire truck and pretended to defeat costumed villains in a local park. The footage of that day is profoundly disturbing in retrospect. It shows a pale, heavily medicated child desperately trying to muster the energy to play, surrounded by a cheering crowd that was unwittingly participating in a macabre, highly public charade. While the child fought through the narcotic fog to smile for the cameras, the mother stood off to the side, readily giving somber interviews to local reporters about her daughter's impending death. Navigating the sprawling pediatric healthcare system, Kelly expertly exploited the fragmented nature of modern medicine. She bounced aggressively between different departments: gastroenterology, neurology, palliative care, ensuring that no single physician ever had a complete, unobstructed view of the girl's true medical history. If a nurse questioned why the child's vital signs were perfectly stable when the mother reported a massive crisis, Kelly would become highly defensive. She immediately threatened to pull her daughter from the hospital's care and take her to another state. She frequently sought second, third, and fourth opinions, shopping for doctors until she found a specialist willing to authorize the next aggressive procedure. There were brief, fleeting instances where medical staff noted glaring discrepancies. Nurses documented times when the child seemed to tolerate solid food perfectly well when the mother wasn't in the room, or periods where she played energetically without any signs of the crippling pain reported just hours prior. But these critical observations were inevitably buried under mountains of bureaucratic paperwork and the mother's fierce, overbearing presence. To keep the doctors chasing red herrings, the mother would artificially induce symptoms just before critical tests, withholding water so the child appeared severely dehydrated, or manipulating the central line to cause localized infections. The medical establishment's inherent design, built entirely on the foundational premise of partnering with loving parents, essentially provided the weapons, the stage, and the funding for the abuse. By the summer of 2017, the medical facade reached a critical, unstable threshold. The elaborate web of fictitious ailments had grown too complex to manage indefinitely. There were simply no more plausible surgical interventions left to demand without triggering an aggressive, multidisciplinary psychiatric review of the family dynamic. The mother recognized this shifting tide with predatory intuition. She completely altered her strategy, pivoting flawlessly from the role of a desperate, relentless fighter to that of a tragically accepting, exhausted parent. She began telling the top-tier pediatric specialists that the heavy medical interventions were no longer working, insisting that her daughter's quality of life had completely evaporated. She claimed the child was locked in an insurmountable, invisible agony, pleading with the hospital's ethics board to allow a dignified, peaceful end. The medical staff faced a terrifying ethical crossroad. They were blinded by years of fabricated records, a massive chart overflowing with hundreds of clinical notes based entirely on the mother's fraudulent reporting. Exhausted by the sheer complexity of the case, the physicians found themselves cornered by their own rigid protocols. The mother aggressively pushed for a do not resuscitate order. She argued fiercely that any further attempts to save the girl, or even to perform basic CPR in the event of sudden cardiac arrest, would be nothing more than state-sanctioned torture. The hospital bureaucracy ground forward. The paperwork was drafted, legally reviewed, and stamped. The ink dried on a document that effectively stripped a vibrant 7-year-old of her right to emergency medical intervention. But a DNR was merely a safety net for Kelly. To secure the tragic, fatal ending she had authored, she had to permanently stop the one thing actually keeping the child alive. She demanded the total removal of the total parenteral nutrition line. The synthetic IV fluid was the girl's sole source of sustenance, given the surgically altered, compromised state of her digestive tract. Removing that lifeline was an absolute, undeniable death sentence. Several attending physicians reportedly balked at this horrific request. Withdrawing vital nutrition from a conscious, communicative, and often playful child violated the most fundamental, deeply ingrained instincts of pediatric care. The clinical team pushed back hard, suggesting alternative pain management therapies or extensive psychiatric evaluations for the family. Yet, the mother leveraged the sheer, crushing weight of the child's massive medical file against them. She weaponized their own previous diagnoses. She cited the phantom bone pain, the supposed unmanageable seizure clusters, and the total intestinal failure that she herself had manufactured through relentless lies. She brought in an external palliative care team, convincing the new doctors that starvation was the most humane, gentle path forward. The doctors, acting on the false, tragic premise that the child's body was already shutting down from an incurable terminal illness, ultimately capitulated to the mother's demands. The central venous line was permanently capped. The heavy, milky IV bags were disconnected and thrown into the biohazard bin. The child was transferred out of the bustling, brightly lit pediatric ward and into the quiet, muted halls of a Denver hospice facility. The transition to palliative care marked the beginning of a gruesome, agonizing countdown. The environment shifted instantly from chaotic medical intervention to sterile, silent waiting. The glaring fluorescent hospital lights were replaced by dim, amber lamps. The rhythmic, synthetic beeping of cardiac monitors ceased. There was no more life-saving machinery, just a small, mechanical bed, a heavily sedated child, and a mother watching the calendar. The physiological reality of starvation is brutal, slow, and merciless. The human body does not simply power down like a disconnected machine. It consumes itself to survive. Muscle tissue rapidly breaks down to protect the vital organs. The heart rate slows to a sluggish crawl. The skin thins dramatically, pulling tightly over the skeletal frame, turning dry and paper-like. The 7-year-old child, confined entirely to the hospice bed, endured this horrific biological process over several grueling weeks. She complained of severe hunger. She begged for water. Her mother responded by simply swabbing her parched lips with a damp, pink sponge. Kelly repeatedly cited the doctor's orders, reminding the suffering girl that introducing real food would cause a catastrophic, fatal intestinal rupture. It was a lie designed to keep the child compliant while her body cannibalized its own reserves. The girl was administered heavy, frequent doses of liquid morphine to blunt the agonizing pangs of a body starving to death. Tension mounted heavily in the quiet room. The breathing grew shallow, irregular. Long, terrifying pauses stretched between each inhalation. The mother sat inches away in a padded recliner. She did not pace the floor. She did not weep uncontrollably. She scrolled through her phone, meticulously updating her thousands of online followers on the tragic, heartbreaking decline of her warrior princess. She posted carefully cropped photos of the emaciated child, framing the brutal starvation as the final, unavoidable ravages of a mysterious brain disease. The scent of lavender essential oil, heavily diffused in the room to mask the distinct odor of physical decay, hung thick in the air. August 20th, 2017. The inevitable conclusion finally arrived. The 7-year-old's heart, totally deprived of basic caloric energy and weakened by weeks of forced malnutrition, simply stopped beating. There were no frantic alarms echoing down the corridor, no crash carts rushing through the doors, just a heavy, suffocating silence. The child who had once enthusiastically sprayed a fire hose and dreamed of fighting villains died not from a rare encephalopathy or a catastrophic organ failure. She died from severe, intentional starvation, orchestrated exclusively by her primary caregiver. The immediate aftermath was a terrifying masterclass in psychological manipulation. The mother did not collapse in hysterics upon finding her child breathless. She exhibited a chilling, highly practiced calm. She quietly notified the hospice nursing staff. She packed her bags with methodical precision. She immediately took to social media to announce the devastating passing of her daughter to a waiting digital audience. The Denver community, completely oblivious to the homicidal reality of the quiet hospice room, erupted in a massive wave of collective mourning. Tributes flooded local news feeds, painting the mother as a tragic icon of unimaginable loss. A lavish, highly publicized funeral was planned, entirely funded by a fresh surge of GoFundMe donations meant to ease the grieving mother's financial burden. Hundreds of tearful people gathered to pay their respects, weeping openly over a small, ornate casket. The mother stood directly at the center of the tragedy, accepting embraces and offering somber, poetic words about finding peace and a life finally free from agonizing pain. She buried her daughter under a mountain of expensive floral arrangements and unwavering community goodwill. She walked away from the cemetery, firmly believing she had committed the perfect, undetectable crime. The medical charade, the lies, and the unimaginable suffering were seemingly buried alongside the child, permanently sealed beneath 6 feet of dark Colorado earth. For 14 months, the grave remained undisturbed, functioning as a silent monument to a tragic, unavoidable medical failure. The deception appeared entirely successful. the mother had seamlessly transitioned into the next phase of her public persona, leaning heavily into the role of a grieving, resilient survivor. The online crowdfunding accounts had been systematically drained to cover supposedly lingering debts, and the local news cycle had moved on to other tragedies. The grim narrative was sealed by a death certificate that listed a vague, complicated illness as the primary cause of mortality. But the architecture of profound deception requires constant, exhausting maintenance. The psychological high of public sympathy and the adrenaline of navigating chaotic medical emergencies are fiercely addictive to those operating within this specific pathology. In October 2018, the mother's compulsion completely overrode her instinct for self-preservation. She returned to the exact same pediatric hospital network in the Denver suburbs, but this time, she brought her older teenage daughter through the sliding glass doors. The clinical claims were immediately severe. She reported that the teenager was suffering from excruciating, unmanageable bone pain that left her entirely bedridden. She provided a detailed, terrifying medical history to the triage nurses, insisting that the older girl had previously been diagnosed with bone cancer during their time in Texas and had endured multiple aggressive rounds of chemotherapy. The pediatric oncology team remembered Kelly. She was the tragic figure who had haunted their waiting rooms just a year prior. Naturally, the physician's initial response was profound empathy, the unimaginable cruelty of terminal illness striking the same family twice. They immediately ordered a comprehensive battery of diagnostic tests to locate the source of the radiating bone pain and to properly evaluate the supposed prior oncological trauma. X-rays illuminated the teenager's skeletal structure. High-resolution MRIs scanned deep into the marrow. Vials of blood were rushed through the hospital's advanced pathology laboratories. The results were jarringly unremarkable. The imaging revealed pristine, healthy bone density. The extensive blood panels showed absolutely no elevated markers for malignancy or infection. Furthermore, a thorough physical examination revealed no residual internal scarring consistent with the surgical insertion of chemotherapy ports or long-term central intravenous lines. The biological reality of the teenager completely and undeniably contradicted the terrifying narrative presented by the mother. When seasoned physicians gently requested the transfer of the Texas oncology files to build a proper, informed treatment plan, the mother's demeanor shifted violently. She became highly defensive, pacing the examination room and offering convoluted excuses about disorganized out-of-state clinics and lost administrative paperwork. The doctors noted her sudden, intense aggression and the total absence of objective medical data. The atmosphere in the clinic turned instantly cold. An attending physician, acting on a deeply unsettling instinct, flagged the teenager's chart for an immediate, comprehensive review by the hospital's specialized child abuse pediatric team. This specific medical unit does not look for pathogens or tumors. They look for lethal behavioral patterns. Administrators bypassed the mother entirely and secured the older daughter's actual medical records directly from the Texas healthcare system. The historical files confirmed the worst suspicions. The teenager had never been diagnosed with cancer. She had never received a single drop of chemotherapy. The entire medical history was a complete, elaborate fabrication. This chilling discovery triggered an administrative earthquake within the hospital network. If the mother was aggressively falsifying a terminal illness for her oldest child right now, what exactly had she done to the 7-year-old who died in hospice care under their watch? The hospital's review board pulled the deceased girl's massive medical file from the secure archives. Examining the thousands of pages with fresh, highly skeptical eyes, stripped away the mother's emotional manipulation. The pattern of systemic abuse became glaringly, horrifyingly obvious. The clinical notes documented endless subjective reports of agonizing pain, severe seizures, and violent vomiting, all reported exclusively by the mother, almost never witnessed by the nursing staff. The objective laboratory results never once supported the catastrophic diagnoses. The fatal decision to permanently remove the synthetic nutrition line was based entirely on the mother's relentless insistence that her daughter's quality of life was gone, not on an acute, verifiable biological failure. The realization hit the medical staff like a physical blow. They had been unwitting accomplices in a methodical, protracted homicide. The hospital administration immediately contacted the local county sheriff's department and state child protective services. Detectives arrived at the clinic in unmarked sedans, operating with strict, silent urgency. They quietly but forcefully removed the older teenager from the mother's custody, citing a severe, immediate medical danger. The public facade had finally fractured. Investigators brought the mother into a sterile, windowless interrogation room under the initial pretense of discussing the older daughter's temporary custody arrangement. They allowed her to speak freely, carefully avoiding any mention of the deceased child. During this interview, the suspect remained aggressively defiant, insisting she was simply fighting a broken system for proper medical care. Then, she made a catastrophic tactical error. Unprompted, she explicitly told the detectives that she had never suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. She vehemently denied ever fabricating illnesses for attention, claiming that she was merely a victim of incompetent, deeply suspicious doctors. The seasoned investigators simply nodded, noting the sudden, desperate psychological defense. They had never even mentioned the psychiatric syndrome. The suspect had just shown them her hand, but psychological profiles and falsified medical records from a living teenager were not enough to secure a capital murder indictment. To prove that the 7-year-old's death was a deliberate homicide rather than a tragic medical misstep, the detectives needed concrete, indisputable biological evidence. They needed the body. In late November 2018, a district judge reviewed the overwhelming circumstantial evidence and signed a highly unusual, heavily guarded exhumation order. Dawn broke bitterly cold over the local cemetery. The frost-hardened earth offered fierce physical resistance. Heavy machinery rolled over the manicured grass, the deep mechanical rumble shattering the morning silence. Detectives, forensic pathologists, and cemetery workers stood behind yellow barricade tape, their breath visible in the freezing air. The excavator's metal buckets slammed into the dirt, scraping, digging, pulling back the heavy layers of deception. When the industrial straps were finally secured and the small, ornate casket was hoisted from the dark ground, the community's perception fundamentally shifted. The rumors leaked out rapidly through the quiet suburban streets. The heroic warrior mom wasn't a tragic figure anymore. She was the prime target of an active homicide investigation. The casket was loaded into a sterile forensic transport vehicle and driven directly to the county morgue, where the absolute truth was waiting to be uncovered. The heavy steel doors of the county morgue sealed shut, entirely isolating the sterile examination room from the media circus brewing outside. Inside, under glaring surgical lights, the forensic pathologist began the grim, meticulous task of deconstructing a 7-year medical illusion. The physical examination yielded immediate, jarring contradictions to the official death certificate. According to the exhaustive claims filed by the mother, the girl's digestive tract was functionally destroyed, necessitating the surgical insertion of feeding tubes and a total reliance on synthetic intravenous nutrition. The scalpel, however, revealed a completely different, horrifying reality. The stomach and intestines were perfectly intact. There was no necrosis. There was no catastrophic anatomical failure. There was absolutely no biological reason why the child could not process regular food. The organs were simply empty, starved to the point of total systemic collapse. The medical examiner moved to the skull, searching for the severe degenerative encephalopathy that supposedly caused relentless seizures and cognitive decline. The brain tissue showed zero structural abnormalities, no lesions, and no evidence of a chronic neurological disease. The skeletal frame, which the mother insisted was racked with excruciating bone pain requiring heavy narcotics, displayed normal density for a child of that age, aside from the severe thinning caused by acute malnutrition. The autopsy report concluded with a chilling, undeniable finality. There were no terminal conditions. The cause of death was not a mysterious, unconquerable illness. It was a lack of basic sustenance, facilitated by the permanent removal of the feeding line, compounded by the heavy, continuous administration of unneeded sedatives. Armed with the pathologist's definitive findings, detectives executed sweeping search warrants across multiple pediatric hospital networks. Law enforcement officers carted out dozens of heavy cardboard boxes containing the child's sprawling medical history. The paper trail was staggering, a chaotic labyrinth of over 3,000 pages of clinical notes, surgical orders, psychiatric evaluations, and pharmaceutical prescriptions spanning several states. Investigators sat in cramped, windowless conference rooms for months, highlighting discrepancies line by line. The process was agonizingly slow and flooded with frustrating red herrings. Early in the review, detectives found hundreds of notes from highly respected specialists who completely supported the mother's narrative. These physicians had officially prescribed the potent medications and legally authorized the drastic surgeries, seemingly validating the phantom illnesses. For weeks, the homicide investigation stalled as law enforcement tried to separate deliberate medical malpractice from aggressive but well-intentioned palliative care. It appeared briefly that the doctors were equally culpable in the fatal outcome. The critical breakthrough occurred when a forensic medical consultant was brought in to synthesize the timeline, mapping the specific origin of each diagnosis. The consultant pinpointed the exact mechanism of the fraud. The attending physicians had not independently discovered the catastrophic symptoms. They were reacting entirely to the mother's relentless, highly detailed subjective reports. If a caregiver stated her nonverbal child just suffered a violent seizure that lasted 10 minutes at home, protocol dictated the immediate administration of anticonvulsants. When the child subsequently appeared heavily lethargic, a direct, known side effect of the heavy medication, the mother pointed to the lethargy as concrete proof of a worsening neurological condition. The doctors were trapped in a clinical echo chamber, chasing symptoms that existed only in the mother's assertions. She had effectively weaponized the hospital's own safety protocols, forcing specialists to perform procedures under the constant threat of medical neglect accusations. While medical experts untangled the clinical web, financial investigators targeted the digital footprint. They subpoenaed bank records, crowdfunding accounts, and internet service providers. The digital autopsy revealed a staggering, highly lucrative grift that elevated the case from psychological abuse to massive state fraud. The mother had raised over $22,000 through public sympathy campaigns, funneling the tax-free donations directly into personal checking accounts. Detectives tracked expenditures that had absolutely nothing to do with specialized medical care. The money paid for rent, groceries, high-end electronics, and personal shopping sprees. Furthermore, the financial audit exposed over $500,000 in fraudulent Medicaid claims, billing the state and federal government for years of unnecessary, invasive treatments. The fraud extended deeply into local charities. The Make-A-Wish Foundation had spent significant logistical and financial resources, granting the ultimate fantasy for a child they genuinely believed was dying. Even the funeral parlor and the cemetery directors had absorbed the high costs of the burial, acting out of profound sympathy for a family they thought was ruined by tragic medical debt. The entire community had been financially and emotionally bled dry. Detectives brought the suspect back into the interrogation room, heavily armed with the crushing weight of the autopsy results and the financial subpoenas. The interrogation strategy shifted immediately from gentle inquiry to a relentless, tactical presentation of facts. The investigators laid out the high-resolution photographs of the intact internal organs. They pushed the highlighted bank statements across the metal table. They detailed the specific mechanisms of the medical fraud, challenging her to explain the pristine state of the child's brain tissue. Her reaction was not one of a shattered, grieving parent realizing a horrible medical mistake. Her posture hardened instantly. She deflected the evidence, blaming specific nurses for incompetence, and insisting that the forensic pathologists simply didn't understand the rare, invisible nature of the diseases. She leaned heavily into her self-appointed role as a medical martyr, claiming she was the only human being who truly understood her child's agony. The investigators recognized the distinct, predatory markers of factitious disorder imposed on another. The financial gain from the crowdfunding was substantial, but the psychological currency was the true motive. The constant, intoxicating rush of community adoration, the adrenaline of commanding trauma rooms, and the absolute power of holding life and death in her hands provided a high she could not abandon. The child was merely the biological vessel required to harvest that attention. When cornered with the absolute lack of physical evidence for the diseases, she retreated into cold, calculated silence, refusing to concede a single lie. The illusion of the warrior mother was her entire identity, and without it, she was nothing more than a predator who had starved her own daughter in plain sight. The arrest warrant was executed with quiet precision. The woman who had spent years manipulating specialists and soaking in public adoration was finally escorted out of her suburban home in handcuffs. The prosecution assembled a devastating case, building an ironclad wall of falsified clinical notes, the damning forensic pathology report, and entirely drained bank accounts. She faced multiple severe charges, including first-degree murder, fatal child abuse, and massive charitable fraud. The sheer volume of documentation guaranteed a grueling, highly publicized trial, one that would inevitably force the surviving daughter to take the stand and testify about her own fabricated cancer. To spare the remaining family from that agonizing spectacle, the district attorney offered a negotiated agreement. In early 2022, the former advocate stood before a judge and formally pleaded guilty to child abuse negligently causing death, along with theft and fraud. There was no theatrical performance this time, no weeping for the cameras. She accepted a 16-year prison sentence. The heavy wooden gavel struck the block, delivering a harsh, definitive finality. The elaborate, years-long illusion was legally dismantled in a matter of minutes, leaving behind only a profoundly fractured community and the cold reality of a mother's ultimate betrayal. The most terrifying monsters do not lurk in dark alleyways. They do not hide in the shadows waiting to strike. Sometimes they sit beside a hospital bed, holding a child's hand under the bright, sterile lights of a pediatric ward. The very system built to heal was meticulously weaponized, turning compassion into a lethal instrument. The tragedy leaves behind a chilling realization. The most profound acts of evil can be executed in plain sight, masked entirely by the illusion of absolute love. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.